Professor Krishnan Tlapu, the VC and Principal of Cape Peninsula University of Technology, Professor Balkaran, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Consular General of Zimbabwe in South Africa, the Consular General of Namibia in South Africa, the Consul General of Angola in South Africa, and the Consul General of Mozambique, honorary consuls of Ethiopia, Ghana, Mauritius, Morocco, Seychelles, and Sudan, Professor Simpiwe Sesanti, faculty, representative of the Faculty of Education from University of Western Cape, Convocation President Mr. Luandile Sochikwa, Student Representative Council President Me Senil Zue, not Lelika, the Dean of Student Affairs Umam Cholwana, Dr. Muslango, the Director of the CPUT Hotel School, Messenger Nelson Uete, the Director of Public Diplomacy from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, Habari Zamuchana, Botardi, Bon Apres Midi, Kolodimudisi Lotle, Amalas Gegroet, Geites, Geites, Galeb. Let me first start with a disclaimer. I am an alumni of the CPUT, so ordinarily this is a very special moment. The 1960 United Nations General Assembly UNGA Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples demonstrated an international anti-colonial consensus. The declaration asserted the necessity of bringing to a speedy and unconditional end colonialism in all its forms and in all its manifestations, and proclaimed that the subjugation of peoples to domination and exploitation constitute a denial of their fundamental human rights, and that it is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations and an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. This was subsequent to a history of African agitation against colonial rule and its system. This includes formal colonial education and economics, which both were considered as unfair and discriminatory. Agitators for independence believed that self-government would substantially reverse this. At decolonialization, administration of all colonies was therefore placed in the hands of Africans, but educated in colonial schools. However, colonial education had colored indigenous African thought, classifying it as pre-logical and pre-critical, disregarding the fact that difference will not always suggest inferiority. Post-independent anti-colonial initiatives informed by post-colonial writings on the subject have not sufficiently nor adequately decolonized the socio-political, socio-cultural, and socio-economic structures which were, in its nature, colonial inheritors. The colonial relationship functioned through acculturation of mechanisms such as assimilation and association, predicated on presumed African inferiority. These mechanisms were justified by international treaties that disempowered and fervent evangelization, as well as arguments that alluded to both imperial profit-making and humanitarian munificence. Colonialism, therefore, was an enterprise of appropriation, familiarization, and utilization, with the overall result being to effectively silence African history, knowledge, and African autonomy. The idea or invention of Africa cannot therefore be divorced from the ideological orientation that drove colonialization. That is, the distinction between the civilized and the uncivilized. That ideological orientation pervades Africa's current relations with the rest of the world. It includes power structures, politics, language, and knowledge. Chuni Achebe, commenting on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, authored in 1899, stated that the book's thesis is based on a presumption of African savagery, barbarism, and intellectual inferiority. A further critic of the Heart of Darkness notes that despite the author's disgust for colonial horrors, a world where Europe did not exercise mastery over Africa was beyond the author's imagination. Post-colonial theory, therefore, recognized that the impotence and dependence of Africa's contemporary political and intellectual elite is premised on external approval and assistance, and result on a hybridity of supposed African authenticity and the attempted replication of colonial character. In other words, post-colonial theory seeks to suggest that the economic and inclusive prosperity of the African continent cannot be achieved without the lodestar of the colonial masters. It is for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, that South Africa's foreign policy pillars are encapsulated within 4 concentric circles, being Pan-Africanism, Global South solidarity and cooperation with the more industrial North, and the transformation of global governance institutions. To appreciate the Pan-Africanist progress being made by the African Union, my contribution is intended to provide a succinct overview of the continent's geopolitical outlook within the purview of the global power struggles. Africa, like any other continent, is immensely important in providing insights into the prospects facing the world, particularly, ladies and gentlemen, given the trajectory from a unipolar to a multipolar world, while forecasting by its very nature is futuristic. It is very often premised that our own current reality has a dialectical relationship with that of the Northern Hemisphere. Pan-Africanists therefore should increasingly be conscious that the transitional epoch from a unipolar to a multipolar world ordinarily ought to imply the deepening of multilateralism. However, ladies and gentlemen, the multilateral system is hamstrung by significant pushback by the big powers, who are reluctant to abandon their unilateral conduct and are opposed to subordinate the narrow national self-interest to the broader good of the world. There are long-term and highly disruptive global situations evolving, which ultimately would pose a challenge for the Africa envisaged in Agenda 2063. Therefore, it's important, ladies and gentlemen, to highlight that Africa is a pivotal region from a social, political, security, and economic perspective, and has experienced a number of developments that are both internal and heterogeneous in nature. Africa is a continent of the future based on the current democratic and economic patterns, and in addition, its voice on important global matters will continue to be articulated and respected. However, domestic political and security challenges in some African states have, however, regressed and threatened to unravel the positive gains that have been made. The geostrategic analysis of the African continent's prospects and outlook is further underpinned by a multiplicity of factors influenced by international developments. It therefore holds, ladies and gentlemen, that Africa indeed is a contested region. The scramble for Africa post the Berlin Conference, post the Cold War and post the colonial period, has been replaced by a more nuanced scramble for influence and resources, driven by both old and new protagonists and actors. What is critical is for us to examine Africa's geopolitical location and response in relation to the multiplicity of both state and non-state actors. At an economic level, prospects within African will continue to be positive, even when the global economy is likely to face headwinds. The democratic dividend in Africa has anchored the rise of the continent and provides a platform for positive prospects in 2024 and beyond. We are home to the world's youngest and fastest growing population cities. We are the home of bold innovations in diverse fields such as fintech and energy, as highlighted by the McKinsey Global Institution report of June 2023. Our population is expected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. In this regard, an abundance of human potential exists for innovation in numerous areas. Despite the outflow of many young African migrants, there has been the emergence of skilled young people, both in their countries and the diaspora, which are beginning to have a positive impact in their home countries, particularly in relation to science and technology, arts, heritage, and culture, eco-tourism fields, amongst others. Entrepreneurship development in some countries, particularly in adaptive fields such as artificial intelligence, is beginning to emerge and is likely to put the African development path on a higher trajectory. The analysis on our internal political and security field is key and critical if we wish to positively respond in the celebration of Africa Day 2024 to a flagship union entitled Silencing of the Guns. The holding of regular elections, that is the democratic dividend, will continue to be a prominent feature across the continent. There will be 17 national presidential and/or national elections in 2024, including, amongst others, Algeria, Tunisia. Just in the SADC region, South Africa, Mozambique, Botswana, Comoros, Mauritius, and Namibia will hold elections. This bodes very well for democratic institutions on the continent and also strengthen our efforts at advancing the AU Africa Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, adopted in 2000. Unconstitutional changes of government, however, continue to be a major political challenge and an impediment. There has been 9 military coups since 2020 on the African continent, and the recent military coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea-Conakry, Niger, and Gabon have brought this unfortunate challenge to the core. Constitutional order in those countries and presents a major cause of concern. The outbreak of these unfortunate activities are in violation of the OAU's framework for response to unconstitutional changes of government, that is the Lomé Declaration, subsequently endorsed by the AU. The influence and presence of external actors, both state and non-state, provides another complicated factor on the continent. There has been an increased resentment of the role of former colonial powers on the continent. However, ladies and gentlemen, inasmuch as the pillars of previous domination are being challenged, those challenges should be executed within the realm of the African Union normative framework. Furthermore, the countervailing forces presented by the existence of alliances across African states, which has been forged with, amongst others, the People's Republic of China, some extent with the Russian Federation, and to a lesser extent with countries like Turkey, will shape and influence the geopolitical outlook. Heightened contestation for influence and access to resources by external actors, both those that Africa regards as their friends and their nemesis. The current development, ladies and gentlemen, takes place at a time when the United States of America have considered to bring up for discussion the African Opportunity Act, AGOA. It takes place within the context of the current Russian-Ukraine armed conflict, which are likely to continue to have an adverse effect on the African continent. It takes place, ladies and gentlemen, against the backdrop of the genocide being perpetuated by the state of Israel, Palestine, both in Gaza and Rafah. South Africa's response to this contemporary geopolitical development has largely been mixed, and security dynamics on the continent remains fluid. The conflict hotspots in 2024 to be the intractable conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Libya, and the entirety of the Sahel region. The current hostilities, ladies and gentlemen, in Sudan, and the unresolved challenges in South Sudan, coupled with the terrorist insurgency, and in Somalia, remains a major threat to Africa's peace and security. In addition, the Pretoria Agreement between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Forces, the TPLF, remains precariously in force. Political challenges, therefore, are likely to impact on a multiplicity of African countries. At a global level, Africa will have to navigate and leverage the benefits of engagements with all state and non-state actors. Africa's economic forecast in 2024 will and are being characterized by steady growth. This year, according to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the continent is projected to be the second fastest growing economic region in the world with a growth of 4%, second only to Asia. This will also be driven by the expansion of trade in commodities such as minerals, whose prices on the world market remains high. Considering our which has largely remained slow in 2023. It is our submission that Africa are on a positive trajectory. A number of African states have in the past couple of years experienced a very good gross domestic product growth. Data published in 2023 by the African Development Bank in its biennial report indicates for that the GDP growth in Benin stood at 6.4%, in Cote d'Ivoire 7.1%, in Ethiopia 6%, and Tanzania at 5.6%, are examples of overarching positive economic growth. In this context, ladies and gentlemen, Africa's economic attraction will remain central to its. The AU have recognized innovation as a key driver of economic growth and development in Africa, and the Africa's Agenda and Blueprint document entitled Agenda 2063 prioritize innovation and technology as a means to achieve the continent's goals. The AU's Science, Technology and Innovation for Africa aims to promote science, technology and innovation across the continent. The AU Commission's Innovation and Technological Hub further seeks to strengthen this particular innovative aspect through providing a platform for showcase their work and connect with investors amongst the 54 African states and amongst the 193 UN member states. These, ladies and gentlemen, are critical interlocutors for economic diplomacy and African integration as envisaged by the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action. Broadening access to Africa's products will therefore be essential for our continent in a highly complex environment, and therefore the continued access to AGOA's preferential terms will be important for Africa. However, ladies and gentlemen, it is our submission that the accelerated implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the ACFTA, is the flagship for Africa's economic integration and inclusive prosperity. From a commodities perspective, particularly in the areas of exploration, prospects will remain positive. However, ladies and gentlemen, what is key and critical is not the extent of export of commodities that African states realize, but the value addition and the beneficiation on the African continent in the interests of the African people. Structural challenges, ladies and gentlemen, will remain and will continue to characterize the African economy. Foremost amongst these would be inadequate private sector financing inflows, both bilateral and multilateral debt, infrastructure deficiencies, unemployment, inequality and rising food prices, and the unprecedented high levels of poverty in a number of African states. These challenges are compounded by high levels of debt, which some of our countries are experiencing, such as Ghana and Egypt. Consequently, debt distress and addressing it will be a prominent feature within the African economic architecture in 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is a leader in the implementation of the African area. It is my submission that this is critical, that we are recognized as a catalyst, given the fact that South Africa are now today South Africa's biggest economy. We are the most industrialized economy on the African continent, and we should therefore evidently utilize capacity to foster more regional economic cooperation and integration. It is our submission that the Southern African Development Community, SADC, provides a conduit and an important launchpad for this envisaged enhanced cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, the AU's theme of the year, Educating an Africa Fit for the 21st Century, building resilient education systems for increased access to inclusive, qualitative, lifelong, and relevant learning for Africa. This theme was launched during the AU Assembly in February 2024 in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Education, ladies and gentlemen, is protected by a large symmetry of international, regional, and national legislation, but more specifically by Articles 13 and 14 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In South Africa, the of decolonization of education is an important debate during the celebration of Africa Day. It is my submission that in our country, on the eve of democratic elections, that this may just involve the decolonization, ladies and gentlemen, of freedom. The rights that comes with freedom, such as the right of association, should not be used as tools to perpetuate colonialism and to stall the decolonial process. To decolonize, as Frantz Fanon has taught us, is to practice humanism as Frantz Fanon made a point in his reflections on colonial relations that the Western man talks about humanism and yet perpetuate anti-humanist projects such as colonialism and neo-colonialism across the world. The temptation for those who suffered and continue to injustices of colonialism is to seek revenge, but to decolonize is to move away from the logic of colonialization that designates others as ontological and epistemological inferior. It therefore calls for us to embrace humanity in all its diversity. The colonial education is a tool of communication between the colonizer and the colonized. It places an emphasis on the individual and dehumanizes an emphasis on community and culture, resulting in ideological dissonance. Post-independent attempts to reverse this, vestiges of post-colonial aspects in contemporary education remain and perpetuate a myth of inferior ideological and indigenous methods and system. Institutions like the Cape Peninsula University of Technology represents a microcosm of society, and thus the decolonization of such institutions will accelerate the process of a much broader transformation that eventually will affect the entirety of South Africa and the African continent. The Organization for Economic and Development, the OECD, identified, Professor Nhlapo, university leadership as a prioritized education policy around the world, and it has called for the development of university leadership frameworks that respond to the current and future educational environment. The OECD further suggests that universities must lay the foundation for lifelong learning while simultaneously such as changing demographic patterns, increased migration, changing knowledge markets, new technologies, and rapidly developing fields of knowledge. Under the impact of colonialism, neoliberalism, and globalization, education continues to produce a system in which the student disengage, which lead to both unemployment and underemployment. Decolonizing theories, ladies and gentlemen, and documents on social injustice gives voices to subjugated knowledge for the voices of the silence to be expressed and listened to, and it challenges head-on racism, colonialism, and oppression, and therefore has convergence with those who advocate for socially just leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, John Dewey, a scholar of utopianism in his Pedagogy of Crete of 1897 wrote, and I quote, "The most formal and technical safely depart from the general process which individuals appropriate, the social consciousness of the race, that is, learning as a feature of participation in social activities." Dewey in 1934 indicated, ladies and gentlemen, that the difficulty with the African society is that it regarded education and not education as an end to itself. And education was generally intended for the immediate induction into society and preparation for adulthood. Education have less emphasized social responsibility, it has less exercised civil duty, and it has less exercised spiritual and moral. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, decolonization, particularly in the African education system, ought to focus on dehumanizing, that is, the creation of conditions that ensure interracial coexistence and mutual respect. It should focus on the pluralization of knowledge, that is, the creation of that ensure that all humans are recognized as producers of knowledge. And lastly, it should focus on the de-racialization of power, that is, the creation of conditions that balance power dynamics in the university space with the power dynamics in society in general. The African University Professor Nslapo ought to be conscious of the history of colonialism, shapes knowledge production and power relations. This is what the forebears of the Organization of African Union, the OAU, envisaged in 1963. And this was further underpinned by the African Union's decision of declaring the African Day to be a key decolonial interlocutor, educating an Africa fit for the 21st century. Asante sana, thank you very much.